Today, I have a great guest I'm super excited to talk to, Dan Andrews of Tropical MBA, among many other things. We'll start with the podcast you guys have been running for many years now. Dan, welcome to the show, and tell us a little bit about what you're working on these days.
Thanks for the welcome, Karl. It remains to be seen whether I'm a good guest or not. So let's, the jury's out on that.
You at least know how to do a podcast. You guys have been doing it for like at least, 10 years? Something like that?
2009 was the first episode. Honestly, the animating idea of the pod was it's not career suicide to build a business, like get out of a 9-to-5 and build a business that gives you a great deal of time and location flexibility. And by career suicide, I mean the idea that you could still build wealth by basically doing your own thing. That was the idea that animated the whole podcast. So I think the first episode, I was like kind of theoretical, like this paradigm is blowing my mind, man. Like, you know, like this is presented as a risky option, but is it risky to like have your time, be able to live where you want and have like better financial outcomes? And at that time, I didn't know if it was true or not. I was just kind of figuring it out. But it turns out to be possible. And so, yeah, we're still talking about it.
I actually kind of want to dive back to when you first became an entrepreneur then, because you brought this up. Was it in your mind like a risky move, or did you always did you ease into it a bit?
It did not feel risky. Working in larger companies was intolerable to me. Particularly because you were rarely doing the thing. People weren't all that interested in doing the thing. So I was kind of a nightmare in some early jobs because I didn't really understand the game. Like I worked at Rawlings and we had like really big operational issues. And I was like, are we going to like solve these? You know, like I was that guy, and that didn't bode well. So I ended up getting an interview with a guy who had a Stanford MBA. And he had a similar experience where he had raised VC. They had built this big tech company all over the newspapers. And it ended up that it completely imploded on them. All this drama, and it was during the .com. And so this guy was like, I'm going to buy a furniture business. And I'm just going to run the shit out of a furniture business. And he would like sleep on his office floor. I remember walking in there and being like, man, you run a furniture business and like the furniture in this office is the shittiest furniture I've ever seen, you know? Like
right.
I had my laptop was like growling at me the whole time I worked there. And I thought it was awesome. It really appealed to me that I could walk into his office and be like, I think we're doing this wrong. And he'd be like, tell me why. And that was like what entrepreneurship, that was like my first introduction into entrepreneurship, which is like, you can just do the thing.
Yeah.
You know? And I wanted to be around people who were doing the thing.
I love it, man. Something you guys talk about a lot on the show is the corner office test, I think is what you call it. Which basically, this resonated with me when I've been a long time listener, and this resonated with me, which is look at who's in the corner office at your place of work and say, do you really want that job? And if you don't, then what the hell are you doing there? You know, don't waste your time in this place where you're at a dead end. And I remember that feeling. I worked at GE in the appliances division back early in my career. And I was like looking at the guys in the corner office, and I'm like, all they do all day is do meetings, and then they talk about how they can't wait to get out of here and go fishing on the weekends. Like they live for their weekends. And look, I mean, I like having hobbies too, but I don't want to be like dreading every day of just triple booked meetings, talking about nothing in this corporate hellhole. It's just not for me.
Yeah. I think the breaking point for me was actually getting a big raise.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'd like we'd done some amazing things, and a lot of it was due to the economy. We had some great ideas. We were, you know, running this thing like a startup. I was in, you know, also there was legacy employees there. It's like, who's this guy? He's really driving us nuts. So I had a lot of energy. I wanted to do stuff in the world, you know, and when I got a big raise once, it was, you know, big percentage wise, like, hey, thank you for doing all this stuff kind of raise. That was when the cracks started to show in terms of having a job. And I thought, it wasn't like I'm not being compensated enough. It's like I did everything possible I could do here to like make this company great. I'm sitting in the office late on Friday nights. I'm doing everything. And I don't think I'll ever get to my goals. Like I can't go to, like I go to China on business trips, but I can't go to China for a month. Like the numbers I'm going to need to realize, like I can't even afford to live in San Diego, which is where I was. So, I drive around these neighborhoods and look at all these big houses and stuff. And I just thought, I can't do any of this stuff. I'm going to have to, and so I thought, well, if I owned my time and location, there's this guy, Lindy Man, who came up with this concept called 4HL, the 4-hour life. And that concept like hit home hard. I like lived that 4-hour life for a long time where I had 4 hours of personal time. But for me, it was even less because I had to like do my own laundry and I was like trying to eat healthy and all this crap. And so I was completely time bankrupt at the end of every week. And I just thought, well, maybe if I had all that stuff back, I could find a way to realize more margin at the end of the day, that I was actually like investing a lot back more into this process of making marginal gains. And so I felt pretty confident in blowing it up and like reducing my expenditures and then figuring out a way to get equity ownership and assets.
Yeah. You guys talk about the 4-hour work week a lot, which was for me, one of the pivotal books in my path towards being an entrepreneur. I read it many years before I actually started a business, but it kind of stuck with me. That whole idea of my time does not have to be connected to income in quite that same linear fashion that employees have. That was a really like a huge realization, and you're kind of describing your version of this realization too. But I'll say the flip side of it that I wanted to ask you about is because what happens when you read that book is you fall into a circle of people that are all starting to look for passive income. And this term gets started thrown around a lot in this space. And a lot of people that are exploring this term, in my experience, tend to be, I'll classify them as wantrepreneurs more than entrepreneurs, people that in theory like the idea of money coming out of the business, but not really interested in doing a ton of hard work for a long time to get there. But anyway, I've come around to this question of like, how passive can these businesses be? Because again, you're talking about how you started to see that like having a business is an asset that doesn't get connected to my time as much, but at the same time, it does still require your input. You've talked about this a lot, how like you can't really completely absolve yourself of it. Like, how do you think about passive income as an entrepreneur though?
It's like a really interesting rabbit hole because it's one of these like bike shedding moments where everybody gets to have an opinion about passive income. The punchline to your question is incredibly so, like ridiculously so, such that if you hang around long enough, you will meet people making millions of dollars a year that work a few hours a week. It is very, very possible. I think the challenge comes is when you mentioned the entrepreneurs seeking out models that promise in a short time frame high return for low effort. These models tend to be arbitrages that are temporarily open. So there's like kind of a dual irony in this, like, which is if you identify one of those arbitrages, your best bet is to work 12 hours a day. Like if you find about Amazon FBA in 2016, the people who won there were the people that went all in, or the people who really won were the ones who built tools. So they invested a bit more, really understood the marketplace, and took that money and put it into S&P or into Bitcoin or whatever. Like, yeah, like that's seeking out these like relatively leveraged arbitrages is decent. The other part of the dual irony, the most passive models are built from the greatest assets. So if you have great margin and defensibility, so you can kind of math it a little bit. Like you mentioned the search funds looking at defensibility, or what did you call it? Quality cash flow.
Yeah, they call it quality of earnings, but
quality of earnings. So that's an interesting way, is like the quality of earnings in, a small service business might not be as high as, Netflix membership. Maybe that's a bad example this week. You can see like there's different cash flows have different levels of durability. And so if you have great margins and great durability, then that kind of business can be extremely passive. There's also like maybe maybe properly rated, but like if you have a core asset, for most people, that's cash. So people look to things like dividend investing or Airbnbs. I have a lot of friends who are really into dividend investing, and it kind of is a cool case study for just this concept of like owning equity in a business. So like the passive part is when you get paid on your equity. The active part is like what roles do you inhabit in the business and how effective are those roles? Are you returning investment on your time? You can actually do all this math in any size of business, which I think for me is a clarifying exercise. Like if I do work, 8 hours a day, what am I doing and how much would it cost to replace? And like, what's the ROI on that in this particular model? Let's model it all out. And that'll give you a sense for the passivity of any given business. So, I was mentioning like an example of like owning a core asset would be, I think it's really interesting if you have a core business that then you use to leverage into advertising deals or service partnerships or licensing deals or joint ventures. That is a really cool passive model. So you could see this with famous podcasters where they'll lend their brand out and they're active because their ROI is enormous on brand building, but maybe not on building a service business off the side. So I'll simply take equity in a service business or also advertising, or I'll license out my brand, and there you go. That's passive income all day. So I think it's like worth thinking about. It's cool. I think the problem that so many of us identify is the promise of easy money, essentially.
Yeah. There seems to be this trade-off that you're kind of hinting at here, which is you can start something with a low barrier to entry that gets your foot in the door as an entrepreneur, but it's likely to be extremely active and not passive at all. I had talking to a friend about starting a moving company, right? And I was like, what are the barriers to entry to that? And he's like, literally nothing. Like put up a flyer in your neighborhood and start getting clients, right? And now it's a hell of a lot of work. You're literally moving furniture for the first, however many months or years until you can get a team. And even then because of this, you have so many fly by night operations that it's a very tough to build trust. And so there's a ton of challenges. That's one side. So very, very actively involved business, hard to make that business passive. It will take many years to get there. And then to your point, there's these ways that we can build up either skills or relationships or even other assets like cash that can become high leverage points as entrepreneurs. And this idea of leverage is a thing I keep thinking of when I think of passivity. Like the guys I know who run really big businesses that, like you say, work a few hours a week and make $10 million in top line or more, they tend to have leveraged their time in such a way where 4 meetings a week gives them so much ROI that's all they have to do. And again, it takes a lot to get there. They didn't do that overnight, but I think that's a really interesting thing to think about when you're modeling a business, any business, whatever it is you decide to do, is like, how much leverage can I get to and how long does it take me to build up that leverage?
Super interesting concept. This is the first thing I wrote down when you sent me the notes. Appreciate that, by the way, was the word leverage. And so the traditional passive model will get its leverage from a platform, which you don't own. Whereas the wealthy guy owns the leverage point, right? So
right.
I think that's kind of the punchline is like, if I'm going to leverage Amazon or TikTok's algorithm 2 years ago or whatever your leverage point is, you have a defensibility window that you need to manage. So it's a bummer if you spent all your FBA money in Bali. It's great if you, because, for everybody that makes fun of these opportunities that brought in the entrepreneurs, we can point to a lot of people that it was talked about for a reason. It's pretty cool, so just got to know that going in and find yourself on the right side of it. What percentage of the audience listening today owns businesses, would you say?
I would say most of them own businesses, and generally we're talking to, agency owners with at least a few employees, kind of gone beyond that very first getting started. But it's, I imagine, a range. Your thought about the FBA thing just made me think of the only truly passive person there in that whole FBA cycle is probably Jeff Bezos or his wife, who could step away from the thing and it would operate, give them cash flow forever. But anyway,
as he did.
Yeah, right. So I think this, obviously we could talk all day about this stuff, Dan, but I will kind of keep us moving here. Another area that I wanted to talk about with you, because this is another reason I love your work and what you guys are doing. You all have a community, the Dynamite Circle community, and you kind of, if I understand it, at least I know the history as I know it, it kind of spun out of like the podcast and giving people a place to go talk about it and sort of support each other. But give me a little bit of your background into starting that, because that was one of my biggest unknowns about, or the biggest discoveries I had about being an entrepreneur is once we got past like, I don't know, $500,000 in revenue, I was in this rare air where I didn't know anybody who had a business like mine that I could talk to. And that community has been like, finding one has been very important to me. Tell me about, when did that become a clear sort of thing you needed to pursue?
That still persists, that challenge of, finding like minds who've done similar things. It is very rare. I mean, even living here in Austin, it's people are interested in this stuff, but for like the listeners that actually have 2 team members and they're cranking it out, like that's super, super rare. We felt that, certainly went to a lot of meetups, no dice, lots of freelance, lots of real estate people, whatever. Combine that with like kind of benchmarking. So there was this podcast in the early days called Internet Business Mastery, which I was a huge fan of. And I knew the guys, and I saw their community on the back end of it. And I was like, oh, this is like a model. Like you can have a show, you can meet up with listeners. And so it was in the back of my mind. I love doing podcasting regardless, but definitely it was like seeing that benchmark and now you can see it with My First Million into Hampton. It's a similar model of, hey, like let's connect people that resonate with a particular message or prototype type person. Ours was like, one listener called us like, we're like the blue collar internet, like a bunch of yahoos just figuring out, we didn't necessarily go to the best schools or have the best backgrounds. We just like saw the internet and was like, there's money there. So that's a little bit the vibe that, we had, the people that we met, people that were obsessed with travel. And I think that's one of the fantastic things about hanging out with entrepreneurs is they can get on a plane, they can go somewhere, they've got free time. So I think the key to the early days of the Dynamite Circle was just in person. It wasn't like a hypothetical community. We didn't ever have to do any marketing. It was simply, let's meet up here and let's make it a hard spot to get to. And if you can show up, it means you're legit. That was a good enough filter in the early days. And it's continued on from there.
One thing that really struck me about you all's podcast and approach to entrepreneurship is how accessible it feels. And what I mean is it's not a lot of like math and theory and business school type concepts. It's a lot of just simple doing the work and, again, finding ways to get a little more leverage for your time and doing the work again. And that always resonated with me a lot. And I think finding that like-minded community of people somewhere that is also in that same boat is a really tough thing to pull off, but also very valuable. I'm curious to hear about like how that group, that core little idea has expanded over the years. Like I know now you do a lot of different, both meetups in person, there's virtual stuff. You've got this DC Black as well. Like tell me more about all that and how that's kind of morphed as time has gone on.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I mean, people over the years, the biggest comment I get about community is like, it's really hard to do. That's what I hear from the peanut gallery. I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of roadmap for community. I think there's a couple maybe hard things about community. The first is that you have to filter your customers quite a bit. So it's sort of a strange deal to be in business where you're not accepting a large portion of the business. And I think that's sort of counterintuitive to most models. For every new customer that you add, they have to like net benefit the other customers. So there's like sort of a balance there. I think the other thing is that you need a strong marketing top end. So, but you know what? All great businesses do. And I think we can avoid that leveraging word of mouth and personal relationships. Like you can grow $1 million business off of personal relationships. So I think with community, if you're going to be filtering customers hard at the top end, probably not quite possible unless you want to do like micro sprint communities, which is a model I think is really interesting right now. So yeah, I think the hard part is that you got to have this like really sticky marketing up front, and podcasting was so criminally underrated, completely off the radar. In fact, I had no idea about the power of podcasting, except that I just loved podcasts. I loved them. I listened to them all day long. And what I didn't realize is how utterly influential they are. Like ridiculous. They're a marketer's dream. I know podcasts that have a few hundred listeners that pull in $500,000 in revenue annually. It's just like they're just that influential, and I think larger companies are starting to understand that.
Yeah,
which is why I think my pet business idea of the month is selling yourself as talent to these larger companies. I think that's an opportunity, something you're going to see open up in the next few years. Because, like, you know, in our space, for example, every business brokerage has tried to start a podcast. It's like one of their partners, and they interview everybody, blah blah blah, and they quit at episode 17. Why wouldn't that brokerage pay you $250,000 a year to do their show for them? They should. They would ROI that, and you would ROI that because you get to mention your stuff as well. Here's how we're making this podcast. We're making it because of my podcast service, you know? So
totally. It's funny you say that because, again, you know, for listeners who listen to this consistently, you know, one of the businesses I own is a podcast production company. And this is over and over the biggest problem that clients have: stalling out, essentially. Like, love the idea of a podcast. They know it's valuable and important, but can't keep up the cadence to do this every week or get a consistent host to show up every week. Super hard to do.
There's like a science behind it, which is something that I've been calling like the influence equation. So the classic marketing dogma is like you need 7 marketing touches. But another way to think about that is like you make an equation of like positioning and proof. So like, how do they see you in them? Are they hate listening? Are they like, you know what I mean? Because there's certain content you look at and you're like, I'm just watching this because it's a train wreck or whatever. But there's certain content that you look at and you say, well, that's aspirational. I'd like to meet more people like that or learn more stuff like this. And then I think the key variable is really time. You know, like if you're exposed to a brand for a certain amount of time, and I think that's what the 7 touches is approximating. And so podcasts are the goated at time, with maybe the exception of documentary or in person. This is also why in-person marketing works really well, because of just exposure and time. I mean, imagine like looking at 7 Instagram ads for a brand versus like hanging out with the founder for 15 minutes. It's a world of difference. So this is the sales pitch for podcasting, and for the value even for like a mid-tier brand bringing in professional podcasters to get people to just enjoy spending time in the brand aura. I think that's why it could be an excellent investment for a lot of companies to bring in talent.
Let's stay on the podcast track here for a second, since you brought it up. And I think this is something I wanted to ask you about anyway. So again, we work with clients to help launch podcasts, right? And so I get this question all the time: what makes a podcast successful? I have an answer. I imagine you have a lot of answers. You guys have been pretty successful at this, but you've also done it for a hell of a long time. Is it just time in market? I mean, is that a big part of the success factor, or is there more to it than just do it consistently for 15 years?
I guess I would invert it. This is a great question because it's kind of hard to answer. I mean, there's like the runaway successes, you know?
Sure. And if you came in as a celebrity, right? Like, of course, you're going to come in and launch to 100,000 listeners right away. But that's so rare that it's not even worth. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So if we replace consistency with the word budget, some of the best podcasts have the best budgets. Okay. So then the question is, well, how do you get budget? And I think the answer is, well, who's listening and who's appearing? And so if you're thinking about bootstrapping a podcast, that's where I would focus first, is like your positioning versus who's listening and who's coming to the show. Because there are a lot of successful podcasts that have not a lot of listeners at all, that are simply client acquisition shows. And that can be a good play. It's like, most people in the world have an audience of 1, 2, maybe their spouse if they're lucky, and 5, 10 employees. You give them an audience of 200, 300, they're down. So I think that works. The other thing is like, take the same dynamic and say, well, what podcast would be worth doing if 100 people listened?
Yeah, I love that.
And so back to the brokerage example, if you have a brokerage, your email list is probably thousands and thousands of people, but say 5% of your buyers or potential sellers would dig in and listen to something that's interesting, about like truly creatively interesting. It's pretty easy to walk yourself into that ROI. So I think that's the interesting thing about pods is like, yeah, they're a little bit expensive to produce. More so on the creative side, probably. So where are you going to get the budget for it? And then how many people do you need to listen to it to make it count? And the answer for most businesses is not many. Your question about, I think question was like, well, how do you have like this killer podcast that like completely crushes? That's a harder question to answer.
I agree. Yeah, I think
took the easy route out.
I agree. Like redefining how you get value from the show is the thing that I come back to a lot too. It's like, yeah, like plan on no one listening for the first year. How could you still make this worth doing? And it's that 100 listeners that are raving advocates for our brand. Like that would still be amazing, right? To 100, you get 50 touch points a year with these 100 people who really love you. That could be worth it already. We've had instances where like, client wants to launch a podcast and they basically say like, we don't really even care if anybody outside of our existing customers listens to it, because that list is so important for us to engage regularly that this would be positive ROI. But then the next question that comes up is often that like, but how do we make this really big? How do we become the thought leaders in this space, or the people the go-to podcast for this thing? And that part is hard. I agree. I think that's like a very tough thing where some timing, some creativity, some luck, like who knows?
I do think the fundamental setup is there, which is that growing podcasts is notoriously difficult. Typically, even the largest podcasts are downstream retention stuff. So if you think about a lot of the most famous podcasts, they're people that are on television, right? Or they're famous comedians or whatever. And it's like the insiders listen to the pod. And they're the ones, and the reason it's so powerful is you've heard this case study time and time again. The percentage of people that will show up to a meetup if you mention it on a podcast is enormous relative to other mediums. So if you have 1 million people watching you on TV and 150,000 listen to the pod, then X number will come to the rally or whatever. That's kind of one frame of thinking about it. But then on the other hand, you look at the podcasts that have taken off, recently, I think Huberman's an example, Jesse Michaels, like there's countless examples. It's like positioning of the talent, like how we're going to position this person. And then what is the total amount of dollars invested in every audio or video that goes out. I just think you need to come up with budget. And, I remember the first recognition of this, you think about it in terms of this. I remember when the podcast Startup came out, and it just blew the doors off of everything that was happening in our little world of business podcasting. And what they fundamentally did was they took an NPR style editing approach and they applied it to the business space and storytelling. Now I'm telling a story too. What is my cost basis? I had to fly to an event. I had to meet somebody like you. I had to hear your story. So, okay, a few $1,000 or whatever. And now I got to sit there for 3 hours and like write the story in an outline and joke about it with my buddy. Okay, so total cost per hour of audio is $3,500. Now, Startup comes along and says, I'm going to spend $35,000 on each hour. They 10x the level of budget they could put into it. And I think this is a common way to win in business is like, can you justify or find a way, to create a $35,000 outcome with $3,500 or justify the expense in the first place. And so that was just the interesting part to me, is like, we definitely thought about it. Like, what if we produce podcast episodes? And we did a few documentary style that we simply just outspent and outworked other people. And that's possible too.
Yeah. You got to have balls to do that though, right? Like to say, I want to spend $35,000 on a podcast episode. And obviously they had experience in radio, going into startup. And so I know there's a little bit of history there, but I think that's where a lot of companies and individuals get really scared. It's like, well, what if it doesn't pay off? And it's like, that's the whole thing. You got to take risk, right? There's no upside without some of that. Yeah.
Well, one common way to de-risk it is to find somebody who's built the asset elsewhere. So Huberman is a decent example of that. You find somebody with the charisma, the ability, and how many, like he's a one of one. How many good looking, yoked guys that have that credential.
Have a neuroscience background. Yeah.
Correct. And then how many endless amounts of hours has he put into that expertise? Now, so if you combine that with your brand or your production abilities, you can own an equity piece in that. And I think one of the cooler like formats of podcasting is like, we've just got this guy on a mic finally. Like there's a millions of dollars worth of knowledge, and we're just going to have him speak in a structured way. So that's another way you can de-risk the enterprise, where you don't have to like go the production side of things.
One of the other areas, this is kind of switching gears again, but one of the other areas I wanted to touch on with you, because it comes up a lot in your story as I've listened to the show, is selling your business. So you guys, for listeners who don't know you and your partners sold a business many years ago, 2016 or so, right?
Around that time frame.
Okay, so 2015, yeah. So you guys were, like you kind of said, doing boring stuff, but on the internet, and furniture essentially on the internet. I'm going to shorten it. Sold this business, and then I've gotten hints of, and maybe you've even said explicitly, a bit of regret here and there. Or at least, you've written a book about it. So you've had some learnings from going through that process. Tell me your sort of like how you think about selling a business. Like, when is it actually worth doing? And when is it not worth doing? Maybe more importantly, because I think a lot of entrepreneurs think it's the easy eject button, when you point out it's really not that way.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a interesting, the punchline is that I regretted selling the business with a big part of myself. And so I kind of went on this journey of like, I don't know, the internet's like a little bit younger in 2013. I'm reading all these articles about, you exit, you make $1 million, all this kind of stuff, and thought, okay, well, we're kind of bored. Like we're facing these sorts of challenges that we don't necessarily want to face. We've got all these team members and stuff. Let's just sell the thing, put a feather in our cap and do something else. Yeah, it's relatable. And the question is like, how do you parse through this, complicated transaction? So the complications are, it takes a long time to sell your business. The other complicated thing is like, your business probably isn't worth that much relative to the cash flows it's producing. So, the amount of time you're going to spend doing the transaction, you've like almost made back a lot of what you're going to get from the transaction as a common punchline. The other thing is like, starting businesses isn't as easy as we think. You do 10 ideas or whatever, like 1.5 works out. So you got one working. Why not push it to potentially a more meaningful takeaway number? I mean, you could just say probably the 8, the book walks through all these thought experiments and stories and how to think about selling your business. I've since talked to hundreds of people in this situation. The primary punchline was one pointed out by Jason Cohen, which is like, yeah, sell your business as if it shelves financial questions for a lifetime. I think that this is probably the decision tree. What's your number? However you get there, the typical way people would do it is 3.5% withdrawal rate. And, I can live off of $250,000 for the rest of my life. And therefore my number is 13 million or whatever. Is someone going to offer you you have a credible offer for $13 million? If the answer is no, read my freaking book and do all the thought experiments.
Right. And even then, I would go further, because I've met guys, and you point this out in the podcast too. I've met guys who have sold their business for much more than $13 million that still struggle with what comes next. Because look, if you're 45 years old and you sell a business for that much money and you think to yourself, I'm going to sit on a beach for the next 30 years, like, good freaking luck. People who do this, they go through entrepreneurship and build big businesses, don't want to just sit on a beach. I think, as you said something in one of the episodes I was recently listening to, it's like, okay, so you're basically like, we don't want a stress-free life as entrepreneurs. I mean, that's not really why we're here. We're here for the challenge. Like, we wake up every day looking at, like, this is why we signed up for this. And I think that's a really good thing to consider before you start looking at, like, selling as some magical moment for you. It's not going to be that, right?
Yeah, it's wild. I will say this. I think the punchline of my research, if I'm going to sum it up, it's like, I too share a story in a book of a gentleman I spent a lot of time with, because we both sold our businesses and we both moved to Spain and rode our bikes all the time, doing the classic thing. We got into endurance sports. Okay. Yeah. I'm such a meme. Yeah. I'm going to ride my bike all day long and outrun my demons. Okay.
Classic.
So what the difference was, is he sold his business for 40 times the amount that I did, and still suffered the types of emotions that you're talking about. Share with me the concepts of, like, missing essentially the sense of purpose, the sense of power. Even your inbox can give you a sense of purpose. People need me. I need to do stuff. I'm involved. I'm a player, blah, blah, blah. The punchline is like, know that going into it, but you should still sell the business. If you can get 13 mil for it, or whatever your number is, you should probably still sell it. Unless you're just some wild legacy person. Like, if you're an Elon, you're not even having this, discussion. So if it's your mission, whatever. But yeah, I think it's remarkable how many people will sell for really, really good money, and then have to deal with themselves, right? You can really not have to dig into yourself if who you were was the person who built this amazing business and everybody respected you for it. It all goes away, and you can only do the speaker, Hajj for so long before the margaritas run out, and you have to ask yourself what you're going to do with yourself. Right.
Totally.
I think it's the most worthy question to deal with. So I think it's still take the money, because the chances that you destroy the whole thing at the market timing is different. This is the most important lesson. If you can sell for your number, sell, and then figure out the internal stuff.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point. And this is something I actually was talking to a guy whose business is at this stage where he could easily sell for $20+ million and he could essentially retire. And he said the only reason he actually I think he's been exploring a partial buyout from private equity, which would kind of give him a little bit of a foot still in the door as on the board, but he would sell, at least a good chunk of it. And what he said was the equation for him was just simply like concentration of risk. 99.9% of his personal net wealth is in this business. And you guys talk a lot about the kind of, the financials of that. And of course, he's saving money on the side for retirement, but like he's always just doubled down on the business because that's where his best ROI is. And he's got the most leverage. And I think that's a really important thing. If you get to that point where you're really that big, is like thinking about, do I need to spread out my risk a little bit? Like, yeah, maybe you still want to operate or be involved in the business, but does it need to be your 99% of your assets? Probably not a good idea at some point.
Yeah. I spoke with someone we would all know in Silicon Valley, and he calls it, you got to land the plane at some point. You got to land the plane. And there's ways to do it without, completely exiting. Take some chips off the table. And I think that's a really cool way to go about it. That's a leverage. I have this incredible private asset. I want to de-risk. And I think there's be plenty of investors that want to be involved in a transaction like that, typically.
Yeah. So the last couple of things I wanted to ask you about are questions I always ask everybody, Dan. One is what's getting you excited these days? I don't know if it's a technology, if it's a new idea, if it's just continuing to do more of the same, or you got something outside of work that's getting you jazzed up. But what are you excited to talk about or think about, do?
Business-wise, it's been a chill year. So the last 2 years, we made a lot of changes in the business, and it was tough. Like Ian and I were just I don't know, just a lot of stress and kind of barking at each other and product launches and all this kind of stuff. And I feel like this year has been about just like delivery. We like simplified a lot across the business. We're going on way more bike rides. We went to Spain this summer. We're hanging out all the time. And we're just kind of like chilling out a little bit and going to the events. Like I'm going to 6 events this year. I'm flying out to Bangkok in a few days and just enjoying the fact that there's so many interesting ideas around us. So business-wise, that's been my vibe. I started a family. I got another one on the way. So I've been like going down the whole trad family reading list, you know? And
oh, that's funny.
one of the things that's kind of crazy to me, I lived out of a backpack for 10 years.
Yeah.
Man, do you have kids?
I have 2. And I also lived out of my car for only 6 months. So I've been a tiny bit of what you've done. And I'm much more settled down now. So yes.
I love being a dad. I'm kind of shocking myself how much I enjoy that. So a lot of that from a business perspective, I'm really interested in like the 1-1-1 business model, or like I just interviewed a guy who has like, if you saw his P&L, it would just blow you away how the scale and profit of this business. And it's very elegant. It is a group coaching model that accelerates a particular niche of people from point A to point B. And the delivery is elegant. It's enormously profitable. The operation is simple. And I've started doing private coaching, and it's really fun, but it is very resource intensive. You know, I spend an hour in advance in the P&L of my client. It's just a lot to like kind of completely frame shift. So the fact that he's able to deliver that to 8 people at once, I think is a model that's like really appealing, because everybody listening to this has an expertise, you know? And so the question is, how can you position that expertise, work 20 hours a week, and make $500,000 a year? And that's the promise of this model. And some people make way, way more than that doing this, which is kind of wild. So from a business perspective, I think the shingle model, hanging out your shingle, being an expert and doing it with the leverage of the web is something I've been thinking about. And then, from a personal perspective, I read a lot of books. I read too many books for one to be important, but I've been really going down the kind of like alien spirituality rabbit hole, man. And there's this book that Tom DeLonge put out with a famous writer in 2016 called Secret Machines. I don't know if you're...
I don't know that.
It's a novel.
Okay.
It's a novel where the sources of the information in the novel were executives at high-level government contractors like Northrop Grumman and not McDonnell Douglas, but who's the big one? I can't remember. The point is it could be a psyop, but old Tom DeLonge went on Joe Rogan's podcast, sounded like a crazy man because he was bugging out about all the information he got. Ended up getting a professional writer to put in a compelling narrative. And this has opened up a lot of, I don't know, you could call it like midlife crisis reading. It's pretty interesting to like see how a lot of this information about government disclosure, which is enormous. It's shocking to me. Sorry, I got to go on this rant here. There are credible individuals that work in our military and in our Senate chambers that are going in front of the Congress and saying we have alien biologics in U.S. government buildings, and that this isn't the number one news story in America. It is the fact that those two things are true at the same time is wild to me. And so anyway, digging into this a little bit more, I think is like core to like the entrepreneurship path to me too. It's like, I want to be interested in like, what is the real machination happening here? Like, why is it happening now? And what is the broader connection to the truth of what we're up to here? You know, I was a philosophy major in college, not an MBA. So for me, it's fun to have some time to just do some private research. And by private research, I mean reading books every
right.
week.
I look, so, man, I don't know this topic area, so I have no commentary, right? Like as far as like the specifics of this, that's your ball in your court. But here's what I'll say, like, and I've always appreciated this about you, Dan. Like you've had some other areas where I may disagree or I may not know enough about it to like, back you up or whatever. But I like that you come down to like first principles thinking when it comes to like just evaluating a fact or a new learning, right? Like I remember you talking a lot about this with things around Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And like, I was always skeptical, but you were like, going into some of these first principle things. I'm like, yeah, there's some good points here. Like, I'm not going to like tell you that you're dead wrong or you're stupid. Like that would be I think a dumb thing to say or naive thing to say too. So I can appreciate, and I appreciate this about a lot of people, but like I appreciate about you, especially the, willingness to kind of go in and be skeptical. And I think that's an important skill for entrepreneurs because we're always looking at the world in new ways. And so I'll kind of.
Well, I think probably my personality, my strength isn't rigor. I think anybody who's listened to the podcast knows that. I've always been curious about the like erotic quality of ideas. Like, oh, well, I mean, maybe aliens aren't true, but that's really interesting if it were. So let's just check it out. And the same thing with Bitcoin. Like, wow, really? You guys are doing a whole new money thing? The biggest mistake in my career, Karl, is I went to a meetup at DC Bangkok, and the title of the meetup was Why You Should Invest in Bitcoin. And it was in 2016. And that was the biggest career mistake I've ever made. There you go.
Oh my God. Yeah. It's again, like, I'm kind of a similar, my business partner is more the data guy. And I'm kind of I don't want to say I'm feelings, but like, I'm much more of when it strikes me and there's something there, I'll dig into it. It's not just about data. It's about some kind of feeling that I can't really describe or like a sense of what's right or the right direction to go. And I think there's a place for that in entrepreneurship. There's like gut feel that needs to be acknowledged. It's not what we do is not just pure data. You can never get perfect data in a lot of these cases. And so you're just kind of always operating with a little bit of that uncertainty and gut feelings. Well, but yeah,
I can tie it back to, we talked about some of our friends who are exceptional founders versus the entrepreneurs, people who are looking for an easy path. And the magic is you hear me like talking about aliens, like I'm so freaking excited. I'm studying the guitar. I'm super excited. Like the best entrepreneurs I know are able to do that about the systems that underlie their business. And, we talked about like some of these clever deals at the top, like, if you can design a system with more leverage, it unlocks wealth. It's like the etymology of the word entrepreneurship is elevating things of lower value to higher level. You move it from here to here, all of a sudden it's worth twice as much. To this person, it's worth this. To that person, it's worth this, just with the rebrand or whatever. And so if you can have that level of excitement and look at your own business as not just a slog, but something that's like deeply intellectually interesting, I think that's the trick. That's because you're building systems. It's really interesting. And guess what? You don't have to do the same thing next year. So it's like a little bit of self-talk is like just the ability to like open your aperture wide and then dig into something specific and design something well for greater leverage. That is a trait that I see highly associated with entrepreneurs who really, really build something special.
Man, that is a great place to leave it, Dan. I really appreciate that. This is so fun. Again, once we get into the philosophy of this, I could talk all day, but I will let you go on to more important things. Dan Andrews of Tropical MBA and Dynamite Circle, Dynamite Jobs. We didn't even talk about the recruiting, but you guys do a ton of stuff. Definitely check out the podcast for those listening. If you like entrepreneurship podcasts, Tropical MBA is one of the greatest of all time, I think. Dan, thanks again for coming on the show. We'll put all the links in the show notes. Anything else to leave the audience with?
No, thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure to be able to chat a little bit. It was really nice to meet you, Karl.
You too, Dan. Thanks. Thank you for watching this episode of Retain Trust. If you like this one, give it a thumbs up and subscribe on YouTube. It takes 2 seconds and it helps others find out about the show. And if you have questions or suggestions for a future episode, leave a comment. See you next time.